The flicker of candlelight dances upon the ancient scrolls of the citadel, where the history of Westeros is immortalized. Among the parchments lies a tale never told, a story born of a question whispered in the quiet corners of the realm. What if Eddard Stark, the Warden of the North, had survived the machinations of King's Landing? "Ah, Ned Stark," the maester begins, his voice laced with both reverence and regret. A man of unshakable honor, thrust into a den of vipers where honor was a weakness, not a strength. Yet what if the axe had stayed its hand? What if the winds of fate had blown differently on that fateful day? The true history, as you may recall, saw the Stark patriarch brought low by his own integrity. Summoned to King's Landing by his old friend, King Robert Baratheon, he found a kingdom rotting from within. Whispers of incest and treachery led him to a terrible truth. Queen Cersei's children were not Robert's, but born of her brother Jaime. Ned, ever the righteous man, sought to confront the queen, granting her time to flee before exposing her secret to the realm. But mercy in King's Landing is a blade turned inward. Cersei's counterstroke was swift. Her son, Joffrey, claimed the throne, and Ned Stark was imprisoned for treason. His name became a rallying cry for rebellion as his sons and bannermen rose in defiance. Yet his life was snuffed out before the eyes of his daughter Sansa and the people of the capital. The north burned, the riverlands bled, and the War of the Five Kings began in earnest. But what if it had not been so? What if Eddard Stark, instead of meeting the executioner's blade, found a path to survival? Imagine the scene. Baelor's sept looms tall against a crimson sky. Joffrey, petulant and cruel, is poised to command the death of the Lord of Winterfell. The crowd roars for blood, yet somewhere in the throng, a decision shifts the balance. Perhaps it is a plea from Sansa, desperate and tearful, that softens the heart of a Lannister. Perhaps Varys, the spider, weaves a web to spare Ned for the realm's greater good. Or perhaps fate itself intervenes, a twist unseen even by the gods. This is where our tale begins, not with a blade descending, but with an unexpected mercy. The Warden of the North survives, and the game changes. The question now is, would Westeros have been better for it? Or would Ned Stark's survival sow chaos anew, reshaping the realm's destiny in ways no one could foresee? So gather close, my friends, and let us step into this alternate past, a world where Eddard Stark lived, where honor clashed anew with ambition, and the ripples of one man's survival touched every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. The tale is long, and the night is young. Let us begin. Divergence Point. The bells of Baelor's sept tolled, their solemn chime echoing across King's Landing as the city held its breath. Eddard Stark, the Warden of the North, knelt before the crowd, his gray head bowed low. The heat of the day mingled with the tension of the moment, and all eyes were fixed on the platform where the condemned awaited his fate. Joffrey Baratheon, newly crowned king, leaned forward in his chair, the cruel smile of a boy playing at power etched across his face. "Bring me his head," he declared, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a blade. But in this timeline, the words were never spoken. Sansa Stark, trembling and desperate, threw herself before the king's feet, her tear-streaked face turned upward, her voice breaking as she pleaded, "Your Grace, show mercy. Prove to your people that you are a kind and just king. Spare him, and they will love you for it." Joffrey's expression flickered, caught between childish defiance and the desire to play the role of a magnanimous ruler. For a moment, his gaze shifted to his mother, Queen Cersei, who sat with her calculating eyes narrowed. Perhaps it was her subtle nod, a signal to preserve the Stark patriarch for her own purposes, or perhaps it was sheer whim that guided the young king. "Very well," Joffrey proclaimed, waving his hand. "The North will remember the mercy of Joffrey Baratheon. Take him to the Black Cells instead. Let him rot." The crowd roared, not in triumph, but in confusion and relief. For a moment, the city seemed to breathe again, though the undercurrent of tension remained. As the guards dragged Eddard Stark away, his eyes locked with Sansa's, a flicker of hope and regret passing between them. This single act of mercy, or manipulation, changed everything. Immediate consequences. Cersei, ever the pragmatist, saw opportunity in her son's choice. By sparing Ned, she ensured leverage over the North, knowing his survival could keep the Starks in check. She whispered to Joffrey that mercy would win him favor among the lords of the realm, though her true intent was far more devious. With Ned alive, she could dangle him as a hostage, a pawn, to ensure that Robb Stark's rebellion never reached full strength. Meanwhile, in the dungeons, Eddard Stark sat in chains, his body battered but his spirit unbroken. He replayed his decisions over and over in his mind, the trust he had placed in honor, the warnings he had ignored. For the first time, he wondered if his rigid adherence to principles had been a folly. Across the narrow sea, Varys, the ever-watchful spider, smirked as the news reached his ears. The survival of Ned Stark was a complication, but one he could use to his advantage. A living Stark meant more threads to weave into his web, more pieces to move in the great game. The North and the Riverlands. In Winterfell, the news of Eddard's imprisonment reached Robb Stark. At first, fury threatened to consume the young wolf, and he swore vengeance upon the Lannisters. But then came the Raven bearing word of his father's survival. Mercy from Joffrey? It smelled of manipulation, but it stayed Robb's hand, for now. Catelyn Tully, ever pragmatic, urged caution. If your father lives, then his life must be our priority. A hasty rebellion will see him killed outright. We must negotiate, Robb, for the sake of our family. But Robb's bannermen bristled at the thought of compromise. Men like Rose Bolton and the Greatjon would not be swayed by words of mercy from the boy king. The Northern lords demanded vengeance for the affront to their warden. The Riverlands, too, found themselves torn. With Eddard Stark alive, Lord Hoster Tully saw a glimmer of hope for a peaceful resolution. Yet the growing might of the Lannister armies loomed, and Riverrun braced for war regardless. King's Landing back in the capital, the power dynamics began to shift. Tyrion Lannister, newly appointed Hand of the King, saw in Ned Stark's survival a precarious situation. The North won't forgive, and the South won't forget, he mused to Bronn over a cup of wine. Keeping him alive may buy us time, but time has a nasty habit of running out. Cersei and Jaime argued behind closed doors. Mercy is weakness, Jaime growled, pacing the room. Joffrey's decision will only embolden the Starks, Cersei countered with her characteristic cunning. Mercy is a tool, Jaime. Ned Stark is a leash for his wolf cub of a son. And should he prove unruly, the leash can always be cut. Meanwhile, Sansa clung to hope. Her father's survival gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She began to tread carefully, learning to navigate the treacherous court of King's Landing, her innocence gradually giving way to a quiet, steely resolve. Essos far away in Essos, Daenerys Targaryen, newly widowed and still reeling from the death of her husband Khal Drogo, heard whispers of the chaos in Westeros. The survival of Eddard Stark meant little to her directly, but the growing instability in the Seven Kingdoms stirred her ambition. If the great houses were distracted by infighting, it could create the opportunity she needed to reclaim her family's throne. The Wall. At the Wall, Jon Snow, devastated by the news of his father's imprisonment but heartened by his survival, found himself torn. Duty demanded he stay with the Night's Watch, but his heart urged him to ride south and join Robb. Yet Maester Aemon's wisdom reminded him of his vows, binding him to the wall even as his family's fate hung in the balance. The ripple effect. With Eddard Stark alive, the Game of Thrones shifted dramatically. Alliances hung by a thread, and the tension between war and diplomacy simmered across the realm. Old wounds festered, new ambitions stirred, and the question of what honor meant in a world of treachery and ambition loomed over every player. The stage was set, and the players moved cautiously, their actions shaping a Westeros teetering on the edge of either unity or utter collapse. The survival of Eddard Stark sent shockwaves through Westeros, creating a new balance of power teetering between fragile diplomacy and outright war. The wheels of fate turned anew, their grooves deepening with tension, betrayal, and ambition. The North rises. In Winterfell, Robb Stark struggled to rally the Northern Lords under the banner of peace, not war. His father's survival gave him pause. Vengeance was no longer the only path forward. But whispers of doubt among his bannermen grew louder. The Greatjon bellowed in the hall, "We should be marching to King's Landing, not quibbling over ravens. Ned Stark lives, aye, but how long if we wait?" Rose Bolton, cold and calculating as ever, offered another path. "A swift strike, my lord. Capture Jaime Lannister. Trade him for your father. Bloodless, efficient." Catelyn, standing at her son's side, urged caution. "We cannot trust the Lannisters to honor any agreement, but if we act recklessly, we lose everything." The North hesitated, and the wolves snarling but leashed. Diplomacy seemed a faint hope, yet Robb held to it. A letter was sent to King's Landing offering terms. Eddard Stark's safe return in exchange for peace. The move was bold, but in this alternate reality, boldness was met with duplicity. King's Landing, a court of shadows. In the capital, Tyrion Lannister read the Stark letter aloud in the small council chamber. "Peace," he said, arching an eyebrow, "from the north. How quaint. Though I suspect they'd prefer not to call it surrender." Cersei leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "The North believes we'll hand over their precious Stark because they asked nicely. They're fools." Littlefinger smirked from the corner. Fools, perhaps, but even fools can be dangerous, especially when desperate. "Peace would be boring, wouldn't it, my queen?" Varys added his usual enigmatic tone. "And yet, war is costly. The boy king's treasury is thin, his allies thinner. A clever leader might see this as a moment to consolidate strength." But Joffrey, drunk on power, scoffed at the notion of peace. "I'll give them their Stark, but only his head. Let the North remember their place." Cersei quelled her son's outburst with a sharp glare, but did not dismiss his words entirely. Instead, she sent an emissary north with a counteroffer steeped in lies. Ned Stark would be released, but only if the northern armies disbanded. Sansa's awakening. In the shadow of court intrigue, Sansa Stark grew shrewder. Her father's survival lit a fire in her heart, one fueled by determination. She watched the Lannisters closely, learning their games, even as she masked her own growing defiance. When Cersei summoned Sansa to weave her charms on Robb, Sansa saw through the manipulation. "Your brother loves you," Cersei said sweetly, "but love can be a weapon if wielded poorly. Convince him to disband his forces, and your father will live." Sansa, her hands trembling, replied with a measured bow. "I will write to my brother, your grace. He'll listen to me." But her words were empty promises. That night, Sansa penned a letter, not to Robb, but to her mother. She warned of Cersei's deceit and begged for patience, promising she would find a way to free her father. The North's gamble. Robb received the Lannister envoy with cold courtesy. His mother and bannermen gathered at his side. The terms were clear: disband his army, and Eddard Stark would be returned unharmed. "It's a trap," Catelyn hissed as the envoy departed. "If you lower your sword, they'll strike without hesitation." Robb agreed, but saw an opportunity in their arrogance. "We'll make them believe we've relented," he said. "Disband a portion of the army, draw them into the open, then we strike." The plan was bold, but it required perfect execution. The northern forces divided, their movements deliberately chaotic to confuse enemy spies. Robb sent a small detachment southward, baiting Tywin Lannister's forces into an ambush. Betrayals and ambitions. Amid the chaos, alliances faltered. Roose Bolton, ever the opportunist, began to correspond with Tywin Lannister. The quiet words on paper were damning. "The Starks are loyal to a fault, but every leash can be broken." In the Riverlands, tensions flared as Lord Walder Free demanded assurances for his support. "My daughter's hand for your loyalty," he snarled. Robb, torn between duty and love for Talisa, hesitated, unknowingly planting the seeds of discord, the Wall and beyond. Far in the frozen north, Jon Snow wrestled with his own demons. The survival of Eddard Stark gnawed at him, filling him with a desperate need to act. Yet his oaths to the Night's Watch held him back. Maester Aemon's words echoed in his mind. "Love is the death of duty." But even as Jon debated, the Wall itself came under threat. Rumors of White Walkers grew louder, and the wildlings under Mance Rayder gathered in force. The true enemy loomed, though few in the realm understood the magnitude of the danger. Essos, Daenerys. Rising across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen began to gather her strength. With the dragons growing and her army expanding, she saw opportunity in the fractured Seven Kingdoms. News of Eddard Stark's survival and the ensuing instability intrigued her. "A realm divided is a realm ripe for conquest," she told Ser Jorah. The ambush Robb's trap was sprung at the Whispering Wood. Tywin's forces, overconfident and unprepared, found themselves surrounded. The battle was swift and brutal, with Robb himself capturing Jaime Lannister in the melee. But even in victory, the cost was high. The Greatjon fell to an arrow, and whispers of Roose Bolton's disloyalty reached Robb's ears. Still, with Jaime in chains, Robb saw his father's freedom within reach. A kingdom divided. As the main storyline unfolded, Westeros was left splintered, its key players locked in a deadly dance of power and survival. Eddard Stark remained a pawn in King's Landing, his fate precariously balanced on Joffrey's whims and Cersei's cunning. Robb's victories secured the loyalty of many northern lords, but bred resentment in others. Roose Bolton's treachery simmered beneath the surface, while Walder Frey's demands grew louder. In the south, Tyrion struggled to maintain order, balancing Joffrey's impulsive cruelty with his own pragmatism. Meanwhile, Daenerys and Jon Snow stood as distant but growing threats, their paths inevitably converging with the chaos consuming the realm. The Game of Thrones continued, but the survival of Eddard Stark ensured one thing: nothing in Westeros would ever be the same. The air was thick with tension, a silence more deafening than the clash of swords. The fate of Westeros now teetered on a knife's edge, and every player in the Game of Thrones braced for the storm to come. The King's Decree. In King's Landing, the small council chamber was heavy with discord. Joffrey, growing ever more volatile, had issued an ultimatum. Eddard Stark dies at dawn, Let the North send their armies if they dare. Tyrion Lannister, now fully aware of the king's madness, tried once more to reason with him. "A king rules with wisdom, not petulance," he said, his voice laced with desperation. "Kill Stark, and you'll ignite a war we cannot win." But Joffrey was deaf to counsel. "The North bleeds if I say it does. I am the king." That night, as the moon cast its pale glow over the Red Keep, Tyrion acted. He met with Varys in the shadows of the castle. "If the spider has any webs left to spin, now would be the time," he said. Varys nodded. "The Whisperers will see to it, but this gamble is yours, my lord." The Great Betrayal. Far to the north, Robb Stark prepared to march on King's Landing, Jaime Lannister in tow as a bargaining chip. But whispers of treachery grew louder. Rose Bolton, claiming to act in the name of peace, had reached out to the Lannisters. As Robb's forces made camp by the Trident, Bolton's betrayal struck like a dagger in the dark. His men turned on the Stark bannermen, cutting them down as they slept. Roose himself confronted Robb, his face a mask of cold indifference. "The North needs stability," Bolton said as his men surrounded the young wolf. "You've led us to chaos." Robb, wounded but defiant, spat back. "You think the Lannisters will reward your treachery? They'll skin you alive the moment they have no use for you." But Bolton's resolve was unshaken. "Better to be feared than loyal," he replied before ordering his men to drag Robb away. Sansa's Gambit. Within the Red Keep, Sansa Stark's mind raced as dawn approached. She had overheard Cersei and Joffrey's plans to execute her father, and she knew this was her last chance to act. Steeling herself, she approached Cersei under the guise of submission. "Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling, "if you spare my father, I will write to my brother. I'll urge him to kneel, to end this madness." Cersei, ever skeptical, studied the girl's face. "And why should I believe you?" Sansa's eyes glistened with tears, but her resolve held. "Because I've seen what happens to those who defy you. I only want my family to live." Cersei, intrigued but wary, delayed the execution by a single day, claiming it as a gesture of mercy. But Sansa had no intention of keeping her promise. That night, she bribed a guard with jewels hidden in her gown, securing a secret passage to the dungeons where her father was held. The escape. As the first light of dawn crept over King's Landing, chaos erupted. Tyrion's Whisperers, working in tandem with Sansa's desperate ploy, orchestrated a daring rescue. Disguised as guards, they infiltrated the dungeons, freeing Eddard Stark moments before his execution. Sansa and her father reunited in the dimly lit tunnels beneath the Red Keep. "We don't have much time," she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. Ned, though weak from captivity, placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're braver than I ever gave you credit for," he said, pride softening his stern features. The escape was fraught with danger. Guards pursued them through the labyrinthine passages, and the sounds of swords clashing echoed ominously. Tyrion, unwilling to let the realm descend into chaos, provided a final distraction. Confronting Joffrey in the throne room, he declared, "You may sit the Iron Throne, but you'll never command respect. Enjoy your rule while it lasts, boy." The diversion worked. By the time the Lannisters realized what had happened, Eddard and Sansa were gone, slipping into the chaos of the city beyond the castle walls. A kingdom in flames. The fallout was immediate. Joffrey, furious at the escape, ordered the city locked down and accused Tyrion of treason. Cersei, torn between protecting her son and preserving her power, found herself at odds with the very forces she had spent years manipulating. Meanwhile, word of the betrayal at the Trident reached Winterfell. Robb, held captive by Roose Bolton, vowed revenge, but his fate remained uncertain. The North, divided and leaderless, teetered on the brink of collapse. Beyond the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen watched the chaos with growing interest. "The wolves and lions tear each other apart," she mused to Ser Jorah. "Perhaps it's time for a dragon to rule the Ashes." The climax left Westeros fractured, its future uncertain. Alliances had crumbled, betrayals had sown discord, and the escape of Eddard Stark ensured one truth: the Game of Thrones was far from over. The world of Westeros, once again, was thrown into turmoil, but this time it was different. The absence of Eddard Stark's execution, his defiance against the Lannisters, had ignited the flames of rebellion, but it had also sparked something else: hope. For the first time in years, the North had a rallying figure, a leader who could bring together the fractured houses of the North and, perhaps, even challenge the Iron Throne itself. Eddard Stark, once a lord of unyielding honor, now found himself at the head of an insurrection. With his family safely reunited at Winterfell, his heart heavy but determined, he began to plot the next steps. The old Stark alliances had to be reforged. The news of his survival spread like wildfire through the North, and every bannerman who had once pledged allegiance to him came rushing to his side. It was as if the very land itself had risen to meet him. But the rest of the Seven Kingdoms were not idle. In King's Landing, the Lannisters scrambled to consolidate their power. Joffrey, more petulant than ever, now had his back against the wall. He could not let this threat live, and so the stage was set for the clash that would decide the fate of the realm. Tyrion, still at odds with his family, walked a fine line. He could not afford to remain neutral for long. With his brother Jaime imprisoned by the Starks, and his sister Cersei growing increasingly unhinged, Tyrion knew it was only a matter of time before the war for the throne began in earnest. The Battle of River Run. As the armies of the North began to rally, Robb Stark's fate hung in the balance. Captured and betrayed by Roose Bolton, he found himself at the mercy of the Lannisters. But with the word of his father's escape, Robb's fate was suddenly intertwined with that of his house. A daring rescue mission led by Jon Snow, Arya Stark, and the ever-loyal Theon Greyjoy unfolded, culminating in a bloody skirmish at River Run. Roose Bolton, finding himself caught between the shifting tides of power, chose to abandon the Lannisters and side with the Starks. The battle raged on, and as Robb was freed, the once great House of the North, crushed under the weight of betrayal, was reborn. The North was united once again, though the cost was high. The Lannisters, still at full strength, gathered their forces to strike back. A choice at King's Landing. With the North reasserting its power, Ned Stark made the ultimate choice. War was inevitable, but not on his terms. Rather than attack immediately, he sought a diplomatic solution. A meeting was arranged in King's Landing. With the Lannisters encroaching on all sides, it became clear that the only way to avoid the complete destruction of the realm was for a truce, at least for a time. Ned, standing before King Joffrey, made an offer. "I will swear fealty to you if you promise the North its freedom. Let us rule our own lands without interference from the Iron Throne." It was a bold move, one that sent ripples through the court. Joffrey, furious at the mere suggestion of his authority being questioned, was quick to reject the offer. But his mother Cersei saw an opportunity. The idea of splitting the realm in two, of creating a cold kingdom in the north while keeping the Iron Throne intact, appealed to her pragmatic mind. She counseled her son to consider the offer, but Joffrey's pride was too great. In a moment of reckless abandon, he dismissed the truce outright, sealing the fate of his kingdom. War was now unavoidable. The winds of change. As armies gathered for battle, the repercussions of these decisions weighed heavily on the key players. Daenerys Targaryen, watching from across the narrow sea, now found herself in the position of power she had long dreamed of. With the Lannisters distracted, she saw an opening to make her move. She had gathered a formidable army, one that could take King's Landing if the time was right. But she, too, knew that the political winds in Westeros were shifting. A dragon's fire might not be enough to stop a kingdom already consumed by its own ambition. Ned Stark, having suffered the weight of his earlier miscalculations, now found himself with a hard-won victory: unity among the North. His survival had forged a new era for his house, one in which he would no longer bow to the whims of kings. Yet, as the battle loomed, the question remained: was the North truly safe, or had they merely bought themselves a fleeting respite? A kingdom torn apart. As the armies of the North marched toward King's Landing, a final, decisive moment arrived. In the shadow of a coming battle, a lone rider entered the battlefield. Tyrion Lannister. He had chosen his side, no longer a mere pawn in the Lannister game, but a free agent playing a game of his own. Would he join his family in their fight for power, or would he betray them once more, tipping the scales in favor of the Starks? The final moment of this alternate history was not a grand battle, but a moment of reflection. War had ravaged the realm for too long. The tides of fate had carried these characters to this precipice, and now it was up to them to decide. Would they continue down this bloody path, or would they change the course of history? The closing of the saga. And so, with the land on the edge of war, the story of what might have been reaches its conclusion, not with the ringing of swords, but with the quiet realization that some things are fated, even in a world so torn by conflict. The Starks, the Lannisters, and the Targaryens each played their parts in this great game, and though their choices shaped their fates, they could not escape the legacy of their blood. As the narrator's voice trails off, they leave the audience with this question: could the Seven Kingdoms ever truly be united under a single crown, or will they remain forever divided by ambition and blood? And if the North stands strong, who among them will rule? Ned Stark, Jon Snow, or someone else entirely? The flames crackle in the hearth, and for a moment silence falls. But the future remains uncertain, for in Westeros, nothing ever stays the same for long. As the embers fade and the last whispers of the tale drift into the cool night air, we find ourselves standing on the precipice of a world forever altered. In this alternate timeline, the survival of Eddard Stark has set in motion a series of events that would have seemed impossible in the original history. The North is no longer the isolated, vulnerable land it once was. It has become a powerful force, its strength not just in the steel of its swords, but in the unity of its people. The House Stark, led by a living Eddard Stark, is once again the heart of the North, its banner raised high against the chaos that seeks to consume the Seven Kingdoms. But what of the Lannisters, whose ambition has driven them to the brink of ruin? Tyrion Lannister, torn between loyalty to his family and his own moral compass, now faces a difficult choice. Does he remain the sly strategist, or does he seek a new path, perhaps one where he might finally seize the power he so craves? And what of the Targaryens, watching from the ashes of their former glory, their dreams of conquest and revenge now threatened by the shifting tides of Westeros? In this world, alliances have been tested, loyalties strained, and the very foundation of Westeros shaken. Yet, one thing remains clear. The Game of Thrones is not yet decided. The power struggles, the betrayals, and the deep personal choices made by each character will continue to shape the future of the realm. And so, we ask you, dear listeners, in a world where the North rises, the Lannisters falter, and the Targaryens return, who will ultimately sit upon the Iron Throne. Will Westeros ever find peace, or will the bloodshed continue, forever echoing in the halls of power? The flames crackle one last time, and the story ends. For now,